I'm not on that.
Is that okay? Yeah, I mean, you were, but if you still want to be.
Was this pasture grazed last year?
Yes, this pasture was grazed last year.
And do you know how many livestock were out here at the time? 300-400?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Yes, so this is a recreation gate. These aren't the typical gates that you'd find on the forest, but they're just for recreational use. These are the gates that get left open most often, and that's a problem for livestock because they can find their way in and out of those and escape and be lost or otherwise. And the fences, so typically with the fences we want to see 52-inch height, and then at the bottom we want
42.
that, 42-inch height at the top and then 18 inches at the bottom with the smooth wire so that pronghorn can get in and out.
And so some of what we're looking at is, the ground cover. And Kevin had mentioned in Nebraska, you don't get a lot of bare ground because you have so much grass cover. And in northern Arizona and southern Arizona, in many areas, bare ground is normal. It's natural. Now, too much bare ground, that's not good. But just because you see bare ground doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. So we're looking at seeing if the cool seasons are starting to green up. And I have noticed a few back there, probably some squirrel tail. Here's one right here. This little guy right here, this is squirrel tail, and you can see that the blades are starting to green up with the moisture we've just had. And now that it's starting to warm up and the soil temperature is warmer, you're going to see some growth. So it's going to take two things for these plants to green up, and that's the moisture and the warmth that we're getting with the current weather pattern. So here's another squirrel tail plant. And you'll also notice that the forbs are starting to green up, and that's something else we're looking at when we want to start bringing cattle on is, are we seeing our cool seasons grasses, our C3 grasses, and the forbs starting to green up, because that's typically what happens in the spring. And what you'll also notice in this area is a lot of grayish brown grass, and this is dormant, and that is blue grama. Blue grama, like we said before, is a C4 or a warm season grass. We're not going to see this warm up probably until the end of June, getting into July. So right now it looks dead, but really this is last year's growth, and we won't see the new shoots coming in until about July. And right here we have some muley. This is probably a spike muley. And again, this one, like the blue grama, will start greening up in the July time period.
One challenge that the producers face in this area would be if their livestock, cows, would start grazing some of the pine needles on the pine trees. This is a problem because if they're pregnant, it can cause the cows to abort.
Like I mentioned earlier, we talked about analyzing how many cattle can be on an allotment. One of the things we look at from year to year, as opposed to during the NEPA process, is canopy cover. And as you can see, when you have a thicker canopy cover, you're not going to have as much understory growing. So there's really nothing here for cattle to eat. That's going to take away and reduce the AUMs that can run on this allotment. And over here, where you don't have the canopy cover, you have more forage available to livestock. Yeah, so when we come in to do to measure forage production, we use this nifty little hoop, and we try to find out pounds per acre. Now, we're not going to go and clip an entire acre, and we can eyeball it, and if you've clipped and weighed enough, which we're going to show you how to do that, then you can calibrate your eye enough that you can actually just walk around and get a good estimate of the pounds per acre of forage. But one way to calibrate your eye is to clip and weigh, and Kevin's going to show you how we at least use one hoop. Typically, the technique includes using this hoop, which after you do the math will equate to an acre of land, and so you're getting pounds of forage per acre. And we would use this hoop and we put it down on the ground 10 times. 7 of those times we would estimate using an ocular estimation of pounds per acre within the hoop, and 3 of those times we would actually clip and then weigh. And what that's going to do is kind of a double blind is what you would call it. And at the end of that transect, we would then be able to do the calculations and get an estimate of pounds per acre in this area of the pasture. It's nice if you can do this on a few different areas of a pasture to get an idea of the pounds per acre in that pasture. There's different times of the growing season and the grazing season that you can measure forage production. It's nice to go in to a pasture prior to cattle coming on so you have an idea of what is there that's available for the cattle. It's also really good to do it at the end of the growing season, so the October time period, just to see what kind of forage production we had that whole growing season. And you know, given the precip that we've had and other variables that came about that year. So Kevin's gonna show us how we clip one of the hoops.
So first thing I want to do, my hoop landed here, so I'm going to kind of look in it and I'm going to kind of sort out some of the duff and pine needles and stuff because I want to make sure not to get that stuff in my sample.
We only really want to clip what they eat.
Yeah, so you're just kind of, within this hoop it'd be kind of just like if a cow came over here and took a bite out. So what you're going to do is you're just going to kind of clip it. You don't want to clip it down at the ground. You kind of just want to clip it like a cow would eat it, so you want to leave a little bit. And then you're just going to take what you clipped and put it in the bag. You're just going to continue to clip inside the hoop.
While he's clipping, I'll tell you that what we also like to document is the species of grass that is in the hoop. And here we're looking at spike muley and carex. And remember, carex is actually a grass-like. And spike muley is one of our C4, our warm season grasses.
Yeah, so when you're done clipping, you just want it to look like a cow grazed here. And you got everything in the bag. And then you want to weigh the bag. And it's based on grams. Typically I take my samples back to the truck with me so I can weigh them there. That way there's no wind or anything affecting the weight. And so the bag weighs, so you're supposed to weigh the bag first and then weigh what you have sampled, and then that'll give you your difference. But right now the bag weighs 25 grams. That weighs 8.
Oh, Carol was right. So 25 minus 8 is 17. So the forage that Kevin just clipped weighs 17 grams. And ideally we would do this about 3 more times with actually clipping, but 10 times total with throwing the hoop down and estimating about how many grams would be within that hoop. And then we would add all of the clipped weights together and then divide that by 9.6. And that's what's going to get us the pounds per acre for this area. And like I said, it's nice to do that a couple more times in the pasture to get a good idea of what's going on in the pasture forage-wise. So when we come out to do our allotment inspections, looking at utilization or forage production, we always try to go to what are called key areas. And a key area of a pasture or an allotment is an area that's representative of that pasture or allotment. So we're not going to go to the steepest areas. We're not going to go to a water source. Those are more, the steep areas, cattle tend not to hang out on steep areas. So we're not going to get a good representation of what's going on in that pasture if we're going to an area cattle don't hang out. On the other end of that spectrum is a water source. Cattle do like to hang out at water sources. So we're not going to go and do our measurements right next to a stock pond or a trough because we're not going to get a good representation of really what's going on the whole pasture, because that one small area is going to get hit harder than the rest of the pasture. So we like to go to areas that are somewhat flat, 0 to 15% slope, not too much canopy, maybe completely open, but we're looking at the whole allotment. So if the whole allotment is treed, then we're going to pick the areas that are more open than not, because the cattle are not going to hang out in the trees. There's nothing there for them to eat. So we're going to pick an area that we know cattle are going to hang out but not spend the whole time there, like next to a water source.
Take things in scale. Sometimes it's the small things you need to exactly.
So these snags are much more recently created snags, more recently died. The trees more recently died to form these snags. And you can tell because they still have a lot of the fine branching on them. The snag behind has lost a little bit more of its bark and branches. But compared to the first snags that we saw, or the other snags that we saw that were in a more advanced decay class, these still have a lot of bark remaining, they still have their tops, and they still have a lot of that fine branching. So you might call this a decay class 1 or maybe 2. Whereas the other snags we looked at are more advanced, maybe more like a decay class 3 or 4, depending on the decay class system you're using. And a lot of studies tend to find that taller snags, larger diameter snags, are better for wildlife. And I remember seeing during one breeding bird season in the spring, seeing a very tall snag that had 4 different cavity nesters using it at 4 different heights on the snag. Sometimes you can look for scratch marks on these snags too if cats are climbing up or bears have scratched.
So we moved over about 3 or 4 miles to the east from the railroad pasture to the Ashurst pasture, but we're still in the Picket Padre allotment.
And right now we're standing at Picket Lake, which is, as you can see, not fenced out. And this is a natural lake. And what they did a long time ago is, if you can tell, there's a horseshoe shape mound right there. And a while back, they actually dug that mound out for an earthen stock pond. And this is one of the ways that we water and manage livestock, is through earthen stock ponds. So you can put those in areas you know you want the cattle to go to, and some of the ways you decide on where to put them is if there's water already existing there, you know water's going to collect there, which is what they did here. And you can also use roadsides as really great ways to capture water. So those are 2 of the places you're going to see earthen stock ponds that we use to water not only livestock but also wildlife. Whenever you have water, you're going to have a concentration of animals, and so we consider these areas to be sacrifice areas. And we don't do our monitoring here because it's not, like I was talking about before, a key area, a representative area, because you're going to see a lot more livestock and a lot more wildlife use here. And other ways that we can manage livestock is through salt blocks and mineral blocks. And we try to put those in other places of allotments that we want to see more use from livestock, and trying to get those away from water. That helps to disperse livestock use throughout the pastures and throughout the allotment. So salt blocks and mineral blocks are not only good for the livestock, but they're good to manage livestock and get them dispersed throughout the area. Something else about this pasture is that it was not grazed last year.
Yeah, I believe this pasture was not grazed and the railroad pasture was grazed.
So when we were walking around, you could see some older signs of cattle from previous years, but it will probably be grazed again this season.
So you can also, if you're able to see the birds flying over the water here, there are a bunch of swallows flying. They're eating insects that are over the water. And I've been out here on years where there's no water here at all. You can walk across here to the other side and never get your foot wet at all. So this is an ephemeral lake. We've had a good wet season over the winter so far. And I've also been here where there is a herd of elk coming in, going from some of these ephemeral waters that are around Ashurst Lake. The waters that have been built for livestock do benefit wildlife, and there are a number of studies that show, and I've done a bunch of work with bats, for example. These waters also do quite a bit for wildlife by providing a water source. And Originally, I believe the Forest Service had installed about 1 per acre, or that was the intention. They aren't at that density now, but it certainly has helped increase densities of elk and other animals that do need a lot of water. And then birds like these swallows are certainly here now because of the presence of this water. So if you stood here over a 24-hour period, you'd probably see a lot of activity at this spot.
Oh yeah.
Something else we noticed when we were coming in this morning, we saw an osprey fly overhead, and we're standing under a snag with a lot of whitewash. So that's what the birds squirt out when they're done digesting. And the whitewash is in sort of a semicircle under a top branch of this snag. So it could be that there's a large bird like a osprey that comes and sits here periodically, maybe after it's fished and is feeding, or maybe just when it's resting or loafing.
And Carol, mentioning the birds and other wildlife reminds me that we do have a lot of wildlife that use these waters, and some of the waters that we have are actually in troughs. And if you're using a trough and some animal gets in there, they can't get out. So what we have to do is put in wildlife ramps, escape ramps in troughs and other storage tanks that might get used so that critters that get in can get back out. And we also look into maybe how bats fly over some of the waters. If we have a trough that has a lip on it, we might want to make sure that there's some way that the bat's not going to run into the lip. And I think some wildlife biologists have been looking at that. I'm not sure really what's coming of that. But so whenever we have structures out there that are for livestock, even though they benefit wildlife as well, we still need to make sure that it's safe for wildlife and that they aren't going to have problems just because we put some more structures out there.
Can you talk a little bit about salt and mineral blocks? Is that something that you have to do for livestock?
Yeah, I mentioned them before, and we'll do it again. So, yeah, salt and mineral blocks are another way that we can manage livestock dispersal in a pasture. So if we're seeing in a pasture an area that is getting more use, and maybe we want to get that use somewhere else, one way to do that is to use salt and mineral blocks and putting those blocks where we want the cattle to go. We like to avoid heritage sites when we're doing that because we're going to get a lot of concentration of livestock. So we don't want to put it in a heritage site. We probably don't want to put it near a T&E species if we have a plant species out there, a sensitive species. And it's nice to avoid packs or something just to be nice, even though the noise won't really bother the owls from the cows. Another reason for salt and mineral blocks is just as supplements to help the cattle put on weight and to be healthy, and especially when you're doing year-long grazing. So this pasture, or this allotment, as Kevin said earlier, is a summer grazing allotment. So they are going to eat the grasses and the forage when it's green and has all the nutrients and the protein that they need. But when you do some winter grazing, like they do in Sedona, all they're getting at that time is the fiber. They're not getting the protein and they're not getting as many nutrients. So mineral blocks at that time are very important to help keep the cattle healthy and help them keep putting weight on. And again, that can also be used to disperse the cattle.
So the quantity of food might be good, but the quality is
not as
poor
good.
and
Correct.
doesn't support as many animals, and you have to supplement.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then something else we can talk about here, and if you end up panning over, you'll see there's quite a few juniper trees over there. And one thing we try to work on in the Forest Service is restoring grasslands and savannas based on soil type. And without knowing the exact soil type here, but this might be an area that is a good candidate for some vegetation treatments so that we can thin out some of the juniper that maybe are overstocked in this area and get it back to a more savanna type, grassland type ecosystem and back to what would normally be here.
There's a vole runway here. A vole runway here and along here. So voles are small mammals. They're active day and night. Many things like to eat them. They'd be prey for raptors and for mesocarnivores. And they form these sort of highways that usually, and this one was sort of covered over by grasses.
Yeah.
So that gives them some hiding cover as they're moving, and they kind of eat these highways clean.
Wow.
So that they can move really quickly among the areas where they need to go for food. And you
Wow.
can kind of follow this all the way down. And
That's awesome.
having enough leftover plant material to
Yep.
cover that provides them the hiding cover, but they're also herbivorous animals, and they tend to feed more on C3 plants than C4 plants. So, these are greening up already.
Yep.
These are C3s, so this looks like a good vole habitat. I noticed that the AMP is from 2006.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about how often that's updated and
Sure.
why is it relevant forever or?
Yeah, so we had talked before about going through the NEPA process, and that with this allotment, when the NEPA analysis was done, it ended up it was an environmental assessment with a decision notice and a FONSI, which is a finding of no significant impact. And from that decision notice, the permit was developed and the AMP, the allotment management plan, was also developed. We cannot create new numbers on a permit or a new season of use on a permit, and we cannot change the AMP unless we have done another NEPA. So the reason that this AMP is from 2006 is because this allotment has not had NEPA done. It has not been analyzed since 2006. A long time ago, when NEPA first came out in 1970, 1969, they talked about projects having a shelf life of 10 years. But when you look at grazing, it's going to go on and on and on until there's some reason for it not to continue, so beyond 10 years. And instead of having to do a new analysis every 10 years, we're now starting to just review the old analyses and seeing if anything has changed on the ground or in our policy. And if nothing has changed, then that old analysis is going to be carried through to the next permit. We won't be able to change the numbers on the permit or the season of use, but we can at least keep the same AMP and the same analysis. So that is why you're going to start seeing these AMPs from 10, 15 years ago, because we haven't had a need to change them.
So do you take into account climate change when you're considering revisions to the plant, the AMP?
So yeah, whenever we're looking at an older analysis or even a slightly newer analysis, if things have changed on the ground, and that can include things that have changed because of climate change, we do take that into consideration. And one of the ways we are addressing climate change in grazing is through adaptive management. So the newer NEPAs, the newer analyses that we're writing, really have a lot on the table as far as what we can do management wise. Can we haul water? Can we put new trick tanks out in the field so that we have more options for dispersing livestock? Can we change the season of use so that in some years they can come on early and come off early? All that adaptive management is really there to not only help the producer be more flexible with their business, but also to help us be more flexible as climate changes, and we need to adapt. That way we don't have to do a new NEPA analysis every time we think we need to change something with livestock management. It's all on the table and we can use it all.
You just said trick tank.
I did.
What is that?
Yeah, so trick tanks are one of the many ways that we can set up water for livestock and wildlife. We have earthen stock tanks, as you saw earlier. We also have pipeline and trough systems that they can be used. And a trick tank is another one that is becoming more and more popular. And what a trick tank consists of is an apron, a storage tank, a small pipeline, and a trough, or a long pipeline and many troughs. The apron is there to capture the rainwater. The apron can either be on the ground or located over the storage tank. And either way, that apron then leads to the storage tank, whether it's through a pipeline system or just draining into the storage tank from overhead. And then that storage tank is able to hold that water for as long as necessary. It goes into another pipeline system that then feeds into a trough or numerous troughs into a pasture. And that's just the newest way that people are really using to water livestock and wildlife. Game and Fish is very interested in trick tanks, and they actually have quite a few wildlife-only trick tanks out on the forest that you'll see sometimes fenced off from livestock use. They're also called drinkers, and so you'll hear that terminology as well. And the other way that we can disperse cattle with water is just hauling water. So if we find that our earthen stock ponds are dry, if rainwater hasn't come and our trick tanks are not as full as we'd like, we can also have the producer haul water to certain areas of a pasture. So those are the different ways that we can get water out onto an allotment and have the water available for wildlife and livestock.
I was out on the Navajo Nation one time. We were doing some field work in Canyon de Chelly. We were netting bats.
Yeah.
We were down in the canyon and we netted a temporary water they'd put in for sheep. They had dug in, it wasn't more than knee deep into the sand. It was maybe meter and a half wide,
Yeah.
and maybe 6 meters long at the most. And that got really heavy use by bats. So it was a temporary water, but
Yeah.
there was so little water available. The sheep needed it, and at night the wildlife used it. In fact, we were going to check a net that was just up canyon a little ways and saw a mountain lion as well. So incredible wildlife coming in to use these water sources.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's really neat. It would be cool to have a camera at every single water source.
Oh yeah.
It would be really
Just
cool.
read this morning in the paper 4 wolves were killed because they were depredating livestock in New Mexico. And so they decided,
Wow.
Fish and Wildlife Service decided to kill these animals. They tried hazing, they tried other things, it wasn't working, so they killed those animals. So that's another interesting, I might
Yes.
bring that article in, and it might be interesting to, one of the students earlier wanted to know, well, what do you think about wolves for the wildlife biologists?
Yeah.
And so they might want to know like some of these
That's a
controversial
great
things.
question, because that is hard, and how are ranchers adapting to it, and even how we adapt to it for management wise. Right now, those particular wolves are part of a 10J population, which means we don't have to change our management. But if they ever stop being a 10J population and they're still endangered and they're in our area, we might have to change our management. We don't know what that looks like yet. And as wolves come into different areas and ranchers now have to deal with them, they're figuring out different ways to work with wolves, and a lot of that is getting different kinds of dogs to watch the herds and seeing if that works. So, yeah.
Oh, interesting. And something else I wanted to ask you, we talked about this with the wildlife biologists in the agency forum, but what are like the hot topics? What are 2 hot topics you're dealing with other than COVID, which is why we're all standing
Right.
apart? But other than COVID, what are some of the hot topics you're dealing with these days?
As an agency or range in particular?
I think range in particular.
Range in particular, just public land grazing. A lot of people don't understand public land grazing, why we have public land grazing, why we allow it, and what the real implications of public land grazing are. So you get a lot of people who don't think it's the right thing to do. They don't understand that this was something that was decided a long time ago, that this was one of the many uses on our national lands. A lot of people don't understand how we manage it so that we're not running these ecosystems into the ground, so to speak. So there's a lot of misunderstanding around public land grazing, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, is making sure people understand what public land grazing is, why we do it, and how we do it. But it is very controversial.
I think one issue that we face too is fencing obligations. So if you have private land up against the Forest Service, it's a fenced out state. So we get calls all the time from people that own land up against the forest wondering why cows are roaming around in their property, and it's because they're supposed to unless they fence them out, it's their liability. So, and then another thing too that I feel like is important, that it's a misconception on how livestock graze as well. Like we get calls and people oftentimes think that cows are pulling perennial grasses out of the ground, but I mean you just can't do that. They're so deeply rooted that they just don't do that. So.
And I think talking about misconceptions, I like that Kevin brought that up. Another misconception I think the general public has is how ranchers really view the land and really view the ecosystem, and they don't want to graze everything away, because if they do, they're not going to be able to graze in the future and they won't have a livelihood. So these ranchers that we get to work with are environmentalists themselves. They really do care about the land, they care about their cattle, they care about the wildlife. So I think a lot of people who don't understand public land grazing and ranching in general don't really get that, but ranchers really do care because this is their livelihood, so it can't go away. So they want to manage it for sustainability.
Well, Mandy and Kevin, thank you very much for taking us out on this field trip today. Semester B students, I really wish you guys were here. It's been a beautiful day. I've learned a lot, and I hope you will too, from the video that we've produced to teach you more about range management.
Well, thanks for having us. It was a lot of fun, and we hope to be with your team again sometime.
Thank you. Yeah, if any students are interested in range, you're more than welcome to stop by the office or call in, and we can set up a time for you to volunteer and come out with myself or the other technicians and do post-grazing inspections throughout the summer.